Stop! You are not allowed in here." The voice, cold as steel, rang out in front of the hospital gate. Not loud, not angry, but enough to halt any possibility. "This is my hospital." The stretcher had already been wheeled away, the ICU lights swallowing the dying child behind the glass, while Amara was left outside the invisible boundary that money had just drawn. The people around glanced over. Some looked sympathetic, some silent shakes of the head. No one objected. No one asked who she was. To them, she was just a Black EMT outside the system, someone without a badge, without rights, not worth slowing down for even a second. The man who had turned his back and walked away didn't look back once. He was wealthy, powerful, accustomed to giving orders and watching doors close exactly as he wanted. In his mind, she was nothing. But Amara didn't kneel to beg. She didn't scream. She stood straight under the cold lights, calm in a way that was almost frightening, because in her head there was a truth that the entire hospital lacked. A small detail, an initial reaction, a piece of the puzzle that, if overlooked, would kill his daughter, and just as she knew it would, only a few hours later, when the perfect protocols began to collapse, when the machines wailed, and money could no longer buy time, the only name they were forced to call back was the name that had been chased from the gate. This isn't a story about pity. This is a story about arrogance laid bare, about seemingly absolute power driven into a dead end, and about the moment a man realizes that the cruelest decision of his life came from his own mouth. What do you think happened when he understood that the only person who could save his daughter was the black woman he had just treated as if she didn't exist? Hello, family. Welcome back. Before we begin, I only ask one small thing. Please subscribe. Every subscription is one way you help stories that have been shut out from the gates of power get told again. And let us know where you're watching from, because together we're not just telling stories, we're forcing the truth to be heard. Amara didn't argue further when security gestured again, their voices polite but final, as if everything had already been decided long before she opened her mouth. She stepped back a few paces, standing under the overhang where the hospital lights cast a cold glow, looking through the thick glass into the hallway where the little girl had just been wheeled away. And in that moment, she understood that the most critical part of the emergency response had not followed the patient inside. On the ambulance, in those first chaotic and fragile minutes, Amara had noted an atypical reaction, a sequence of signs that didn't match what textbooks usually describe, but they hadn't yet been turned into complete data in the hospital's intake system, existing only in the memory and experience of the person who had directly felt that faint pulse. When the doors closed, that chain of information was severed, not because someone deliberately hid it, but because the system wasn't designed to listen to those considered outsiders. Inside the hospital, everything ran smoothly exactly as it always did in emergencies at a top-tier medical facility. The doctors quickly took over the patient, looked at the screens, read the vitals, cross-referenced the hastily entered records, and applied the standard protocol proven across thousands of similar cases. Medications were ordered, equipment was connected, each step precise, efficient, with no room for panic. In those first minutes, no one thought anything was beyond control, because every number fell within an explainable range, and faith in the system was so strong that it made doubt unnecessary. In another hallway, Richard Holloway stood watching the medical team work through the glass, the familiar feeling of control returning. He had built this hospital on the belief that there was no room for improvisation, that safety came from tight procedures and clear authority, and the decision he had just made at the gate was merely a small part of that philosophy. An EMT from outside, no matter how well-intentioned, didn't belong to this system, and keeping her out was entirely by the book. In his mind, the matter had ended the moment the doors closed. There was no reason to revisit or reconsider it, because his hospital was built to not depend on factors outside its control. None of the people working inside questioned the moment at the gate. None went back to ask if something had been missed in those first few minutes, because everything still looked fine, and collective confidence made the possibility of error seem remote. Meanwhile, Amara left the hospital grounds through the ambulance bay, the sirens and lights behind her gradually fading, leaving her with the familiar heavy feeling of cases where she knew the trajectory, but no longer had the ability to intervene. She wasn't angry, nor surprised, just a cold certainty that a small detail, seemingly insignificant, had been left behind that glass. In the ambulance seat, Amara closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the patient's abnormal reflex, that off-phase heartbeat, and knowing that if treatment continued down the familiar path, that fragile body would soon rebel in a far more violent way. It wasn't a vague hunch, but a conclusion drawn from frontline experience, from cases where mistakes didn't come from malice, but from a failure to listen. A completely valid decision, made properly and with full authority, had just created a life-threatening gap, and no one inside the hospital realized it at that moment. Inside the ICU, Richard Holloway's daughter was quickly moved to a sealed area, where everything operated to the highest standards the hospital prided itself on. White lights shone down on the bed, machines connected in a perfect circle around the tiny motionless body, and the doctors began working with absolute focus. The intake record appeared on the screen, the parameters entered from the ambulance, and the initial hospital exam were considered sufficient to guide treatment. The standard protocol for the suspected condition was implemented immediately, dosages calculated precisely by weight, age, and recorded history. In the first minutes, everything went as expected. Heart rate stabilized slightly, blood pressure rose, and the graphs on the monitors gave the impression that the patient's body was responding to the medical interventions. That smoothness only reinforced the belief that the initial decision was correct, that nothing was outside their control. But very soon after, small signs began to appear, not clear enough to trigger alarms, but enough to create abnormal curves on the monitoring screens. Heart rate would spike then slow irregularly. Oxygen saturation fluctuated within what was still considered acceptable, and the body's response to medication wasn't quite like previous similar cases. The doctors looked at those numbers, exchanged brief words, then offered reasonable explanations within their familiar knowledge framework. Children's bodies sometimes react unpredictably, acute stress can cause fluctuations, and more time was needed for the drugs to take effect. No one in the room thought to pause and question the input data, because the system had given them the sense that all necessary information was already in the record. The initial notes were seen as complete, and minor dosage adjustments were considered the most rational approach for now. Time passed in the tense but familiar rhythm of the ICU, where every minute was measured by heartbeats and the steady beeps of monitors. Richard Holloway stood behind the glass, watching the medical team work with near absolute trust. He saw the doctors converse in specialized language, saw nurses move swiftly between equipment, and felt a growing reassurance that everything was on track. The small fluctuations on the screens didn't worry him, because he was used to seeing variations explained and controlled through science and procedure. If something was wrong, he believed his hospital would be the first to detect it. Meanwhile, at the bedside, the little girl's body began reacting in ways the standard protocol hadn't anticipated. Some indicators improved more slowly than expected. Others shifted in hard-to-explain directions, but each time a temporary explanation was offered to keep the overall picture within normal. No one suspected that a critical piece might be missing from the start, because the system didn't encourage searching for what hadn't been officially recorded. Data was considered complete because it had been entered, and anything not in the system practically didn't exist in decision-making. Reliance on protocol was so strong that it masked the small signs gradually building into a bigger problem. With each passing minute, the patient's body had to cope with interventions that weren't entirely suitable, and the mismatch between treatment and biological response grew clearer, though still not enough to make anyone slam the table and demand a full reevaluation of the approach. While the indicators in the ICU continued to be monitored and interpreted in the familiar language of machines and charts, Amara was already far from that world, standing outside the boundary that the hospital's glass gates had just drawn so decisively. She was no longer within the range of the white lights, no longer hearing the steady beeps of monitors, only the sound of the ambulance engine preparing to roll out for the next call. Her phone stayed silent, no follow-up calls, no requests for additional handover, not a single question from the hospital, as if her role had ended the moment the girl was taken through the doors. As an EMT, Amara was used to leaving after handing off a patient, but this time was different, because she knew what she carried wasn't just vague worry, but a specific piece of information that had never been transferred. Yet the system had no place for things outside official procedure, and once her name was no longer linked to the patient code in the internal system, all connections were instantly severed. She couldn't call directly into the ICU, had no line to the attending doctor, and no access to any channel related to that case. This silence wasn't hostile, it was simply how the hospital operated when someone had been deemed outside. Amara sat on the low step outside the emergency area, watching people come and go with clear roles, each with a badge, rights, a place in the system, while she had none. She considered whether to try contacting them again, but experience told her that any unsolicited effort now would only be seen as unnecessary interference, even an annoyance. Once the doors had closed that way, they didn't just block her physically, they completely erased her chance of being heard in the subsequent decisions. Inside the hospital, no one mentioned her name, no one revisited the moment at the gate, because the system had taken over the case as it always did, and those outside were no longer part of the picture. With each passing minute, the distance between Amara and that case wasn't just a few dozen meters of concrete and glass, but an invisible wall of authority and power. She realized she had been excluded from every discussion loop, not because of incompetence or error, but simply because her position wasn't recognized in this hospital's power structure. No one called back to ask about the initial reaction, no one requested she explain the signs she had seen, and no one thought that removing someone who had been on the front line minutes earlier could create a dangerous gap. In that silence, Amara clearly felt the powerlessness of someone who knows what's coming but has no way to influence it. She wasn't angry or dramatically disappointed, just the familiar heavy feeling of being pushed aside by the system, where field experience isn't considered valid data if it doesn't fit neatly into the input fields. She stood up, left the hospital grounds to continue her shift, carrying the cold certainty that if the treatment inside didn't change soon, those normal signs would soon reveal their true nature. Inside the ICU, the subtle unstable signs that had only lurked on the charts began to manifest clearly in a way that could no longer be downplayed, as Richard Holloway's daughter deteriorated faster than anyone had initially predicted. Heart rate spiked, then plummeted suddenly. The curves on the screens lost their smoothness and became jagged, and oxygen saturation dropped below safe levels, despite intensified interventions. A nurse spoke up to alert the doctor, her voice calm, but her eyes already showing clear concern. And within minutes the room that had run smoothly shifted into emergency mode. Red alerts sounded, the sharp noise cutting through the air, drawing additional staff from nearby rooms, each taking their assigned position. Medications were switched, dosages adjusted, respiratory support equipment intensified, but the small body on the bed responded sluggishly, as if resisting what was being given to save it. The doctors quickly reviewed the protocol, exchanging rapid specialized terms, trying to find the deviation in what had been considered a standard sequence of decisions. When one intervention failed, they moved to another, then the next, each step performed by the book, by procedure, but the results weren't as expected. Time began to take on a concrete and terrifying shape, no longer steady passing minutes but dangerous gaps between heartbeats, prolonged seconds as monitors blared continuous warnings. In that moment, the belief that everything was under control began to crack, though no one dared say it aloud yet. Richard Holloway stood behind the glass, initially maintaining the posture of a man who believed the best team was working for his child, but that confidence was quickly eroded, as he watched intervention after intervention fail to produce clear results. Each alarm made his shoulders twitch, his hands clench then release, his eyes no longer calm, as at the start. He asked the doctors for updates, receiving careful professional answers, but they no longer carried absolute certainty. "We're doing everything we can," became the most repeated phrase, and this time it no longer brought reassurance. In the room, the doctors began to realize they were chasing symptoms, rather than controlling the cause. But identifying the cause was difficult when the initial data had been accepted as complete from the beginning. No one thought to pause and re-examine the moment of patient intake, because under the harsh time pressure of the ICU, all attention was focused on keeping the patient from crossing the final line. Yet with each minute that passed without improvement, the truth grew clearer: time was not on their side. A younger doctor suggested a stronger intervention. The attending nodded after a few seconds of consideration, and another series of actions was performed in tense urgency. The result was still not as hoped, and the charts continued to reflect a body slipping out of control. The atmosphere in the ICU grew thick, not the cold focus of before but a race against the clock, where every decision carried life or death weight. Richard Holloway no longer stood still. He paced behind the glass, eyes fixed on the bed, searching for the smallest sign of hope. The belief that his hospital could not fail had turned into a vague fear, then gradually into real panic, as he realized that money, power, and procedure could not force his daughter's body to respond. He began asking questions, not just for confirmation, but searching for an escape, but each answer circled back to the same point. They were following protocol exactly, and no clearer option was available. It was in that very moment that the consequences of the refusal at the hospital gate began to take undeniable shape. The absence of one small piece of information, seemingly insignificant, had now become a deadly void, and as time continued its relentless march, everyone in the ICU felt they were paying the price for a decision made very early, very quickly, and very by the book, yet one that left direct and brutal consequences on the life lying before them. As the successive interventions failed to yield the expected results, and the graph lines on the screens increasingly showed a worrying trend, the ICU room entered an entirely different phase, where professional confidence had to give way to a question that should have been asked much earlier. The attending physician stood still for a few seconds, eyes fixed on the flashing numbers before shifting to the team around him, his voice lowering as he voiced what everyone felt but no one had dared admit. Who handled the patient before admission? The question wasn't loud, but it caused the atmosphere in the room to sink noticeably, as if a forgotten piece had finally been named. A nurse turned to the computer, beginning to review the initial intake records, lines of data hastily entered during the most tense moment of the emergency. The timestamps appeared, each handover step listed in the familiar sequence. But the closer they looked, the more they realized a small gap right at the starting point, where the case should have been described in the most detail. There's a record of pre-hospital emergency care, the nurse said, voice hesitant, but no direct handover. The attending frowned, requesting additional data from the city's emergency system, and within minutes, the secondary screens displayed information about the ambulance that had brought the patient here. The unit name, response time, basic first aid actions recorded, and then a name appeared on the initial response crew list. Amara Lewis. The atmosphere in the room shifted completely when that name was read aloud, because it triggered a vague memory that a few people began piecing together. One nurse recalled the moment an EMT had stood outside the hospital gate, trying to say something before being stopped by security, and her eyes darkened as she realized the connection. She wasn't allowed in, the nurse said quietly, as if unwilling to believe her own words. The attending asked for more details, and each piece was quickly uncovered. An outside EMT, not affiliated with the hospital, had handled the patient from the very first minute, had made initial observations, but had been denied entry for a direct handover. The incident at the gate, previously dismissed as insignificant, suddenly became the center of every gaze in the ICU. Richard Holloway, standing behind the glass, sensed the change in the air even without hearing the full exchange, and he moved closer, trying to read the increasingly grave expressions on the doctors' faces. When Amara's name was mentioned again, this time with full context, Richard froze. The memory of the moment he ordered the gate closed suddenly resurfaced so clearly that he could no longer ignore it. The attending requested all pre-hospital data, every small note read aloud, and among them was a brief description of the patient's abnormal reaction immediately after collapsing, a detail never mentioned during the treatment so far. The truth began to take shape ruthlessly, as everyone realized the current treatment direction might have been based on an incomplete assumption from the start. No one in the room said the word mistake, but the exchanged glances were enough to convey that they were facing the consequences of a decision that had eliminated the most critical source of information. The initial question echoed again, this time not to seek an answer but to confirm an unavoidable reality. The only person holding the missing piece had been left outside. Richard Holloway was no longer detached from the story. He stepped into the small conference room beside the ICU, demanding to know more about that EMT, and as he heard the full account of the gate incident from security and intake staff perspectives, a chill ran down his spine. The decision he had once seen as proper procedure and authority was now cast in a completely different light, not as necessary management, but as a door slammed shut, at the exact moment it shouldn't have been. The attending returned to the ICU, his voice more resolute as he stated, a conclusion no one could dispute. We need to talk to her. No one questioned whether Amara belonged to the hospital or had a badge, because in this moment, those boundaries became meaningless before a truth that was now glaringly clear. The truth had returned. Not loudly, but insistently, forcing everyone to confront it, with no way left to avoid acknowledging that the case had veered into danger the moment the initial information was blocked at the gate. The decision was made faster than any prior discussion that night, not as a concession, but as a survival reflex from a system that had just realized it was missing the most vital piece. A doctor left the ICU, heading straight to the coordination desk, demanding immediate contact with the emergency unit that had transported the patient, his voice no longer evasive or reserved. The call connected in seconds, and on the other end, Amara answered while preparing for another shift, her voice as calm as ever, though just hearing St. Luke's told her exactly what was happening. There were no apologies, no lengthy explanations, just a brief statement from the hospital that they needed her back immediately, that the patient's condition was critical, and her initial observations could be decisive. Amara didn't question it, showed no excess emotion. She simply confirmed her location and said she was on her way. When her vehicle stopped at the hospital gate for the second time that night, the scene was entirely different from before, even though the gate and lights remained the same. Security was waiting, not in a blocking stance or with suspicious looks, but silently swiping a card and letting the glass doors slide open, creating a path that had been firmly closed just minutes earlier. Amara stepped through that threshold without slowing, without looking around, without seeking anyone's gaze, as if entering a place long familiar, though in reality, this was her first time ever allowed inside this hospital. The brightly lit hallway led straight to the ICU, and when she appeared at the door, every eye turned to her, no longer with doubt or questions of authority, only the urgency of people needing an answer. The attending quickly brought Amara to the bedside, asking her to describe exactly what had happened before the patient was transferred in, not interrupting, not pressing, just listening. Amara spoke evenly, detailing the body's first reaction when she arrived, how the skin changed color in seconds, the heartbeat out of phase with external signs, and a small indicator she had seen in rare cases before, where the body reacted negatively to a certain class of drugs. The room fell silent as she spoke, and for the first time in the entire treatment process, data came not just from screens but from a person who had directly witnessed the case's opening seconds. The doctors began cross-referencing her words with what was unfolding before them, and the scattered pieces suddenly fit together in a frightening way. A hypothesis was raised, then quickly verified against indicators they had previously overlooked or explained differently. The attending turned to his colleagues, issuing orders to change the treatment direction, immediately stopping the current medication, and switching to an alternative that matched the reaction Amara had described. No one asked if she was sure, because time no longer allowed hesitation, and the logic in what she said was too clear to ignore again. In the minutes that followed, the entire medical team shifted to the new approach, decisive actions replacing the previous deadlock. And Amara stood right by the bed, monitoring every smallest change, ready to speak if anything didn't align. Richard Holloway stood in the back, against the wall, unnoticed by anyone now, and no longer needed for decisions. He watched his daughter cared for by the same team, in the same room, but with a completely different approach, and in that moment he understood that what was saving her wasn't his power or wealth, but the information he had once dismissed. The next minutes passed heavily yet tensely. until one of the critical indicators began stabilizing in exactly the direction Amara had predicted. Heart rate slowed. The curves on the screens grew smoother, and oxygen saturation rose steadily, not in the erratic fluctuations of before, but in a clear trend. No one cheered, no one sighed dramatically in relief, but the exchanged glances among the doctors were different, carrying intense focus mixed with cautious hope. The attending nodded slightly at the screen, signaling continued close monitoring, and in that moment everyone knew they were on the right path. Amara stepped back half a pace, giving space for the team to continue, but she remained there, ready to add any further detail if needed. Richard Holloway moved forward one step, stopping just behind her, and for the first time that night, he looked at her not as an outsider or disruption, but as the person who had brought what this entire hospital had lacked. There were no immediate thanks, no public acknowledgement, just a heavy silence full of meaning, as his daughter lay there, still fragile but no longer slipping from their grasp. In that stark white room, amid the machines gradually returning to a normal rhythm, the truth stood clear and undeniable. The black woman once blocked at the gate, once seen as an unnecessary outsider, was the one who had provided the decisive piece to save the billionaire's daughter. Not through miracles or sentiment, but through frontline knowledge, and the listening this system should have offered her from the very beginning. After the treatment direction was adjusted, the ICU room gradually settled into a very different silence, not the suffocating tension of red alerts, nor the emptiness after defeat, but the heavy quiet when every eye followed the smallest changes with absolute caution. The indicators on the screens began stabilizing in a rhythm they hadn't achieved before, heart rate no longer falling into terrifying gaps, curves becoming more continuous, and oxygen saturation holding steady at a safe level long enough to no longer be seen as temporary fluctuation. The doctors spoke little, standing close to the bed, communicating through glances and brief phrases, as if any excess words might shatter the fragility of the moment. One nurse noted the time of improvement, another double-checked equipment, all done more slowly than before, not from lack of urgency, but because for the first time in hours, they could allow themselves to believe the patient's body was truly responding. Amara stood at the room's edge, neither advancing nor leaving, observing with the familiar focus of someone long accustomed to the line between life and death, and as she saw the heart rate maintain stability across multiple cycles, a quiet certainty formed that the girl had passed the most dangerous phase. No audible sighs of relief escaped, because in the ICU, returning life is never celebrated too soon, but the shift in atmosphere was clear enough for everyone to feel. Richard Holloway leaned against the glass wall, hand pressed to its cold surface, eyes never leaving his daughter, and for the first time since entering the hospital, fear no longer overwhelmed everything else in him. He watched the medical team continue working, but with a new calm, and he understood that the worst had likely stayed behind them. In that space, Amara's role needed no verbal repetition. Her presence alone said everything. The doctors discussed among themselves what had just happened, comparing data before and after the treatment change. And the more they examined it, the clearer it became that the initial information Amara provided was the turning point of the entire case. No one disputed it. No one tried to downplay her role with neutral terms, because the results were too evident to deny. A younger doctor glanced at Amara and nodded slightly. Not as polite thanks, but as straightforward acknowledgement between professionals that she had seen what the entire system had missed. Amara returned the nod similarly. No smile, no excess expression, because for her this moment wasn't personal triumph, but confirmation that frontline intuition and experience still held value in a world increasingly reliant on screens and protocols. The girl lay still on the bed, breathing more evenly, complexion less pale, and vital signs no longer had to be fought for minute by minute. A nurse adjusted the blanket carefully, as if afraid to disturb that fragile breathing, and when the monitors resumed their familiar steady beeps, the ICU seemed to settle another layer deeper. No one said stable with certainty, but everyone understood they had passed the most perilous stretch of the shift. Richard Holloway turned to look at Amara once more, his gaze no longer carrying distance or suspicion, but a new, heavy, hard-to-name recognition. He didn't approach, didn't speak, just stood there, letting the truth exist in the space between them. In that silence, Amara's role was acknowledged in the simplest yet most powerful way, not through declarations or dramatic gestures, but through the very life returning on the bed. The ICU continued operating, machines recording each heartbeat, each breath, and in that collective quiet, no one doubted that without the timely intervention of the black woman once refused at the gate, that night could have ended very differently. When the heart rate on the screen had maintained stability long enough to no longer be considered fragile, Richard Holloway quietly left the ICU observation area and stood alone in the empty hallway outside, where the white lights stretched across the glossy floor like a mirror reflecting thoughts he could no longer avoid. In that silence, the moment at the hospital gate returned with painful clarity, not as a vague memory, but as a film replayed in slow motion, frame by frame. He remembered exactly how he had walked up, his voice decisive, the cold gaze of a man accustomed to making decisions without explanation, and the short sentence that had ended all other possibilities. "You are not allowed into my hospital." At the time, he hadn't seen himself as cruel or wrong, just as doing what was necessary to maintain order and control in a chaotic moment. He believed procedures protected people from emotional decisions, that this hospital existed precisely to not rely on factors outside the system, and that closing the gate to an halt EMT, no matter how well-intentioned, was a minor detail not worth further thought. But now, standing in this quiet hallway, every rationale that had once reassured him felt fragile. He began piecing together the events of that night, from the moment his daughter was brought into emergency care until the red alerts blared continuously, and recognized a truth he could no longer deny. Everything had begun slipping out of control right after he ordered the gate closed. He recalled Amara's eyes when she said she held critical initial emergency information, not pleading or challenging, but the certainty of someone who knew something vital and was trying to convey it in the brief time available. Back then, he hadn't listened, not because he doubted her, but because he trusted himself and the system he had built. Now, the hallway's silence made the question he had avoided ring clearly in his mind. If he had let her through that gate, if he had allowed a few minutes for direct handover, would his daughter have had to endure those critical hours? The answer didn't need to be spoken aloud. It was already present in every heartbeat just pulled back from the brink. Richard Holloway felt a heaviness unlike any before. Not fear of loss, but confrontation with personal responsibility that money and power couldn't shield. He was used to viewing his decisions as reasonable in the broader context. But this time the broader context no longer mattered, because the consequence of one seemingly small decision had nearly taken the only thing he couldn't replace. In his mind the words formed slowly, not as dramatic self-reproach, but as a cold, irreversible conclusion. That decision had pushed his daughter to the edge. No one forced him to admit this, no judgmental looks or accusations from those around him, but the truth stood firm, stark, and unrelenting. He thought about how he had always believed that if the system was run correctly, there would be no room for error, and for the first time he realized that very rigidity had turned the system into something incapable of listening when it mattered most. Richard turned to look toward the ICU, where his daughter lay, and in that moment, he no longer saw his hospital as a symbol of power or achievement, but as a place that had nearly become a witness to the consequences of arrogance disguised as order. He didn't try to justify his decision or shift blame to circumstances or anyone else, because every path of explanation led back to the same point. He had chosen not to listen, and that choice had nearly cost his daughter's life. In the empty hallway, Richard Holloway stood still for a long time, letting that truth settle, not to punish himself, but to remember it in a way that couldn't fade, because he understood that there are moments in life where a seemingly valid decision carries enough weight to change everything, and that night he had faced the direct consequences of such a decision. Richard Holloway returned to the ICU area as the shift moved into a different rhythm, no longer a frantic race against every second, but the cautious monitoring of those who had just crossed the thinnest line. He stood there, close but not interfering, listening to the professional discussions carried out in low, restrained voices, and throughout that time he said not a word to explain or defend his decision. There was no "I didn't know at the time," No, I was just following regulations. No attempt to shift responsibility to circumstances, security, or the procedures he had once believed infallible. His silence wasn't avoidance, but a wordless acknowledgement that every argument that had once made him feel right had lost value before the truth lying on the bed. As the doctors reviewed the case, comparing data before and after the treatment change, no one needed to point out the obvious. The results spoke for themselves. Life returned when the information blocked at the gate was finally brought in at the right moment. Richard listened, nodded, and remained silent, not from lack of words, but because he understood that any justification now would only dilute an unchangeable truth. He was accustomed to using words to guide, persuade, and protect his decisions, big and small, but that night he chose not to, because for the first time words no longer carried enough weight to shield the consequences. In the ICU's white light, the truth stood simply and coldly. His daughter had been saved not by a perfect protocol, but by finally listening to the person excluded from the start. Richard clearly sensed the shift in how people looked at him, not with criticism, but with a respectful quiet for someone facing his own mistake. He didn't request to meet Amara right away, didn't seek dramatic thanks or apologies, because he knew such gestures, if too soon, might be seen as self-soothing, rather than genuine acknowledgement. Instead, he stood quietly, letting the case progress and professional conclusions unfold fully, without inserting himself, without influencing. As if for the first time in his life he accepted not being at the center of every decision. That silence spread through the space, not heavy, not tense, but a new balance where no one tried to prove themselves right, and only the truth existed independently, needing no protection. When a doctor concluded the patient had passed the most dangerous phase, thanks to the timely treatment change, Richard simply nodded, eyes never leaving his daughter, and in that nod there was no complete relief. Only full acceptance that everything could have been very different if that truth hadn't arrived in time. He didn't soften the story with managerial or strategic phrasing, didn't turn the mistake into a cliched valuable lesson, because he knew it needed no framing or further explanation. The truth stood on its own, needing no support from him, and his refusal to justify, blame, or find an escape for his ego made the moment clearer than any declaration. In the quiet ICU space, amid steady machine sounds and unchanging lights, Richard Holloway for the first time let a truth exist without trying to control it, and in that release everything appeared as it truly was. A valid decision had led to error, an excluded person had become the key, and life was preserved when no one tried to cover or excuse what had happened. As the emergency gradually subsided, and the patient moved to stable monitoring, conversations in the hospital began shifting in a different direction, no longer about fighting for life minute by minute, but facing what had nearly caused that life to be lost. In a small conference room near the ICU, doctors, the head nurse, and clinical management sat together, not to find individual blame, but to dissect a gap everyone had seen too clearly. The pre-hospital patient intake process was addressed first, each step reviewed, from the moment the ambulance stopped at the gate to full handover to the in-house team. One question repeated in that room, not accusatory, but sobering: what had prevented the most critical information from entering with the patient? No one denied the old process was built for control and safety, but that night had proven absolute control could become a deadly barrier when it silenced frontline voices. Everyone in the meeting understood that without Amara's timely intervention, the outcome would have been very different, and that understanding made change not an optional improvement, but a mandatory requirement. New procedures were proposed that same night, with specific, clear adjustments outside EMTs. Even if not hospital staff, must be allowed direct clinical handover of critical information in emergencies, at least in the first minutes. Pre-hospital notes would no longer be entered as raw data alone, but verified through direct exchange. When abnormalities were noted, security would no longer be an absolute block, but a coordinating link in the emergency chain. These changes weren't presented as favors to any individual, but as a way for the system to protect itself from the rigid limits it had exposed. Richard Holloway was present at the meeting, but he didn't sit at the head of the table or lead the discussion. He listened, occasionally asking short questions focused on how the new process would truly prevent the scenario that had unfolded. There were no long speeches, no image-conscious statements, just clear consensus that this hospital could not continue operating, as if that night were a rare accident, not worth recalling. The adjustments were documented, responsibilities assigned, and implementation deadlines set immediately, not letting the matter fade into memory like many other lessons in large organizations. Outside the room, the hospital continued running as usual, new patients arriving, new shifts beginning, but inside the system, a quiet yet profound shift had occurred. Preventing the mistake from repeating was no longer an ethical slogan, but a new operating principle built on the painful reality just experienced. Everyone understood the change wasn't meant to weaken control, but to open a necessary gap for truth to enter at the right moment. No one named Amara in the meeting as a symbol, but her presence lived in every revised line, every added step of the new process, as a silent reminder that a system is only truly safe when it knows how to listen to those on the front lines. When the meeting ended, the atmosphere wasn't heavy or relieved, but carried a quiet determination that what had happened would not be forgotten. The system had been forced to change, not by public pressure or fear of legal liability, but by a simple, undeniable truth. If that gate continued closing as before, there would come a time when no one could turn back in time to open it. As the hospital gradually returned to its familiar rhythm and news of the emergency case spread beyond the stark white walls of the ICU, attention began shifting from medical charts to the story behind the gate that had once been closed. The first calls to Amara didn't come from the hospital, but from unknown numbers, polite voices of reporters introducing themselves, saying they wanted to hear her story, to know how it felt to be the woman who saved the billionaire's daughter. To capture that moment as a symbol of courage and overcoming adversity. Amara listened in silence, letting them finish, then replied briefly that she had nothing to tell. She wasn't avoiding them or showing annoyance, just a calm refusal, much like how she had stood outside the hospital gate that night without arguing. To her, what happened wasn't an inspirational tale needing embellishment, but a long shift with a correct decision made at the right time, after too many delayed minutes. When one reporter asked if she felt she had been treated unfairly, Amara paused for a few seconds before answering that she didn't want to turn the incident into a debate about emotions or identity. "I did my job," she said, her voice steady and firm, as if that was the only answer needed. Subsequent interview offers and suggestions that she could become a symbol for change arrived one after another, and she turned them down with the same calm demeanor. Amara didn't want her image framed in bold headlines or the story reduced to a moment of individual heroism, because she understood the greatest danger was when a systemic mistake gets covered by a beautiful narrative. For her, the focus wasn't on who gets praised, but on whether what happened would repeat. In the rare conversations with close colleagues, Amara simply said she had done nothing more than share the information she had, and that anyone in her position should be listened to the same way. She returned to her shifts, continuing to board the ambulance, continuing to handle other emergencies, as if that night was just one part of the long chain of days in the career she had chosen. Media attention gradually moved to other topics, fresher stories, and Amara made no effort to hold on to it. She understood that refusing to become a symbol didn't diminish the value of what occurred. In fact, it kept the truth in its proper place, not as a story about an extraordinary individual, but as proof that a system is only truly safe when it respects and listens to those on the front lines. When Amara said "I did my job," it wasn't calculated humility, but her way of affirming that saving a life shouldn't require titles or spotlight. It only needs the conditions for the right information to reach the right place at the right time. A few days after that long night shift, in a recovery room that had lost the familiar urgency, Richard Holloway's daughter opened her eyes for the first time since passing the most dangerous phase. Daylight was softer than ICU lights. Curtains partially drawn to let in a rare sense of normalcy, and the girl's breathing was now steady enough that no one needed to stand constantly by the bed. Doctors spoke cautiously but optimistically, saying recovery would still take time, but the most important thing was that her body had found its rhythm again. Richard stood beside his daughter's bed, for the first time allowing himself to breathe slowly, not staring at screens like someone awaiting judgment, but looking at the face gradually regaining its familiar color. When Amara was informed the patient had woken, she didn't rush over or treat it as a moment that had to be witnessed at all costs. But when Richard requested a short meeting, she agreed, not for formality, but because she knew some things don't need lengthy explanations. The room was quiet when Amara entered. No dense machines, just a few basic monitors, and the lighter air of a place returning to life. The girl looked at Amara with curious eyes, carrying no memory of the critical hours, only seeing a stranger with a calm, low voice. Amara smiled lightly, introduced herself, said nothing about what had happened, didn't mention the moment at the gate, or the decisions that had nearly decided the girl's fate. She simply asked how the girl was feeling, and when she received a soft reply that everything was better now, Amara nodded as if that was the most important information to hear. The meeting was brief. No tears, no overly emotional thanks, because neither needed them to understand the meaning of this moment. Richard stood nearby, quietly observing, not interrupting, giving his daughter and the person who had helped keep her in this world a private space, even if just for a few minutes. He didn't apologize or try to explain further, because he knew that now any words would be superfluous before the simple reality that his daughter was alive, awake, and gradually recovering. Amara wished the girl a quick recovery, said the nurses and doctors would continue caring for her well, then turned to Richard with a single nod as a farewell, carrying no further implication. When she left the room, no one held her back or tried to prolong the moment, because life doesn't need to be framed in tearful scenes to be meaningful. The girl remained on the bed, eyes less tired, breathing steady, and the world continued around her in the most ordinary way possible. For Amara, that meeting wasn't a reward or a dramatic closure to a story, but a quiet confirmation that her work had reached the right outcome. For Richard, it was the clearest moment he saw the consequence of one decision and the value of listening, not through spoken lessons, but through the concrete image of his daughter recovering day by day. No one in that room tried to make the moment more special than necessary, because its very simplicity said everything. No miracles, no orchestrated emotional climax, just a life preserved and continuing to grow, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. After his daughter was moved to recovery and routine checkups, replaced the ICU's tense pace, Richard Holloway left the familiar inner hallways and walked to the front, where the glass gate had once been the clearest boundary between his power and the truth he hadn't heard in time. The afternoon had turned late, fading sunlight, reflecting off the transparent surface in patches of light and shadow, and that scene brought the gate moment that night back more vividly than any recollection in an empty hallway. Richard stopped exactly where he had once ordered security to close the door, where he had spoken the short sentence that ended all other possibilities, and this time there was no ambulance, no sirens, no chaos to obscure the meaning of that action. The hospital gate remained there, unchanged, operating smoothly as designed, opening for those authorized and closing for those not, like it had never been the center of a decision that nearly decided a life. Richard didn't touch the glass, didn't signal anyone. He just stood and looked, letting that physical distance remind him of the distance he had created between his system and truth from outside. No words were spoken, because none could capture the feeling now, as he realized the very gate that had once given him absolute control had exposed the greatest limit of that power. He thought about how he had believed safety came from sealing every entrance tightly, and now understood that sometimes safety comes from knowing when to open. People passing by paid him no mind, seeing just a man standing before his own hospital's gate, and that anonymity made the moment even more real, no staged lesson for others to witness. Richard stood long enough to feel the shift in how he viewed that gate, no longer as a symbol of ownership, but as a silent reminder of the responsibility tied to every decision made from his position. No one demanded an apology or public confession, because what needed acknowledgement had already happened inside him long ago. When Richard finally turned and walked away, the gate remained still, ready to open and close for the next cases, but for him it would never again be the old gate. In complete silence, no words, no dramatic gestures, that moment closed a chapter he could never again view with the same eyes as before. because the place where he had once refused Amara had become the clearest marker of the truth he had to accept. After the day Richard Holloway's daughter woke and the hospital gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, the story didn't end with a ceremony of honor or a spotlighted closing moment. It quietly continued exactly as life always does. Amara returned to her daily work, boarding the ambulance each shift, facing new emergencies, new people needing to be held minute by minute, and that night gradually became part of her professional memory. No more, no less. She didn't change how she worked, didn't carry a sense of having experienced something special. Because for Amara the value of the job lay in handling every shift with the same focus and responsibility, no matter who the patient was. On the other side, inside that private hospital, the changes were implemented quietly but decisively. No press releases, no grand slogans. Pre-hospital intake procedures were updated, direct handover channels opened for emergencies, and security retrained to understand the gate wasn't just a control point, but a link in the life-saving chain. These adjustments carried no name like Amara's, attached to no personal story, but everyone working there knew exactly why they existed. The glass gate at the front remained in place, sliding open and closed daily with the flow of patients and staff, but its meaning had changed in a way no device or chart could measure. It was no longer merely a boundary of authority, but a silent reminder that true safety sometimes comes from knowing when to listen to a voice from outside. Richard Holloway continued his role, running the hospital with the same decisiveness as before, but in later decisions there was a small pause that hadn't existed before. A moment he asked himself if something was being missed. He didn't mention Amara in large meetings or retell the story as a moral lesson, because he knew its value lay in not needing to be retold to exist. And Amara, when her ambulance stopped at other gates, at other hospitals, still stepped down with the same calm demeanor, still did what needed doing in the most fragile first minutes of a life, and still left when the task was complete, carrying no expectation of recognition or reward. If someone later retold this story, they might speak of a hospital's change, of the moment a system had to examine itself, but at the center of it all remained one simple, undeniable truth. He had once refused to let her into his hospital, but she was the only one who could save his daughter's life. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories about compassion, justice, and the quiet strength of people. See you in the next video, where every story reminds us that sometimes, one small decision can change an entire life.